The streets of Harrow's Bend were empty. That was the first thing a stranger would have noticed. Not the broken glass outside the general store. Not the door hanging wrong on the saloon. Not the horse trough tipped on its side in the middle of the main street with the water long since soaked into the dust. The first thing was the emptiness. A town of 200 people, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, with not a single soul visible on the street. They were inside, every one of them, behind closed doors and shuttered windows. In the particular stillness of people who have learned that visibility is a liability. Children pulled away from windows by mothers who did it without explaining why. Because explaining would require saying out loud what was happening, and saying it out loud made it more real than they could currently afford for it to be. The gang had ridden in 3 days ago, 7 men, led by a man named Cordelum, who had the particular quality of certain dangerous men. Not the loudness of someone performing threat, but the quietness of someone who doesn't need to perform it, because the threat is simply what they are, visible in the way they move, in the economy of their violence, in the flat and businesslike quality of their eyes when they're doing something that other men would require themselves to be angry to do. They had taken the sheriff's office on the first day. Not dramatically. They had simply walked in and walked out with the sheriff's badge and his guns and his deputy's guns and the keys to the jail. And the sheriff, who was 53 years old and had a bad knee, and had spent his career keeping a quiet town quiet, had made the calculation that every man makes when the situation exceeds what he has available to meet it. He had let them take the badge. On the second day, they had established themselves. The saloon as headquarters, the stable for their horses, the general store as a supply depot from which they took what they wanted and marked in a ledger that they told the owner was a record of debt. The owner had not argued. He had 2 daughters. On the third day they had gotten comfortable, which was when things had gotten worse. Comfort made them expansive. A family on the edge of town had their harvest taken, the whole of it, loaded onto a wagon, driven away in the afternoon, while the father watched from his doorway with his children behind him, because going to the doorway was as far as his courage and his arithmetic had allowed him to go. An older man who had said something nobody was entirely sure what he'd said. The accounts varied, had been left sitting in the dust of the main street, in a way that made the point without making it necessary to go further. The sheriff sat in his own jail, and the children of Harrow's Bend pressed their faces to window glass and watched the empty street and asked questions that their parents answered as gently as they could, which was not gently enough, because there was no gentle enough for the truth of the situation. One child, a girl of 8 named Lucy, whose mother had been trying to get her away from the window for an hour, pressed her hand flat against the glass, and watched 2 of Delum's men walk the empty street with the proprietary ease of men who have assessed a situation and found it satisfactory. "Isn't there anyone left?" she said. Her mother didn't answer, because, what do you say to that? What do you say when the honest answer is that there might not be? That the people who would have once answered the call of a town in trouble were gone, or old, or outgunned, and the town was on its own, and had been on its own for 3 days, and might be on its own for longer. Her mother pulled her away from the window, and in the silence that settled over Harrow's Bend like a second skin, nobody heard the thing that was already happening. 30 miles to the west, on a remote stretch of frontier land where a man lived alone, and had been living alone, and had no particular intention of being involved in anything. A rider had come to that land, exhausted, half fallen from his horse, with the look of a man who has ridden hard for a reason, and the man who lived alone had listened to what the rider said, and had gone inside, and had come back out, with a rifle and a saddlebag, and the expression of a man who has made a decision he didn't want to make, and is not going to unmake it. The bandits of Harrow's Bend didn't know any of this. They were comfortable in their stolen saloon, and they had every reason, by their own accounting, to believe they had already won. They had no idea who was riding toward them. That was their biggest mistake. His name was John Reardon, and the territory had a story about him. The story was the kind that accumulates around certain men in certain places, built from pieces of truth and inference, and the natural human tendency to make the facts more coherent than they actually are. The parts that were true: he had been, in his 20s, one of the most capable men with a gun in the territory. Not the fastest. Fast was a quality that got overvalued because it was measurable, and the things that actually decided confrontations were less measurable and therefore less discussed. What he had was something different. An accuracy that didn't degrade under pressure. A calm that wasn't performed. A quality of decision-making in the specific compressed time of dangerous situations that separated him from other men, the way certain athletes are separated not by effort, because plenty of men had the same effort, but by something native that effort couldn't replicate. He had used these qualities in the service of law enforcement for 6 years. 3. As a deputy in a cattle town that needed one. 3. As a marshal in a territory that needed one more. He had been, in those years, the thing that such men are when they are doing the work well: effective, fair, and expensive to those who chose to make themselves his concern. And then he had stopped. The stopping had a specific date, a specific afternoon, a specific set of facts that he did not discuss with anyone, and had not discussed with anyone since, because the discussing of them served no purpose, and made them present in a way they didn't need to be present, when they were already always present. He had gone to the remote land, and built a life on it that was organized around simplicity. Cattle enough to sustain him, not enough to require hired hands. A garden. A horse he treated with the careful attention of someone who has decided that certain relationships are still worth having. The daily work of a small operation run by one man, which is considerable work, and leaves limited time for other things, which was part of the point. He did not go to town often. He did not make friends, in the usual sense. He was not unhappy. He was careful not to examine too closely whether he was happy, because the examination tended to produce answers he didn't find useful. He knew the violence was still in him. He was not naive about this. The capability doesn't leave a man because he decides to stop using it. It stays available, like a tool put away in a drawer. He had put it in the drawer, and he kept the drawer closed. And he was very deliberate about the things that might open it. The rider who came on a Tuesday morning was a man named Hector Vales. He ran the livery in Harrow's Bend and had ridden 3 hours through the night, because he was the only one who knew where Reardon's land was, having sold him the horse 2 years ago, and remembered the direction he'd ridden. Hector told him about the gang, about Delham, about the sheriff in his own jail, and the farmer's harvest, and the old man in the dust, and the children behind closed windows. He told him about a family at the edge of town, the Marsh family, who had a daughter of 12 and a son of 9, who had been specifically threatened by Delham in a way that was not ambiguous. Reardon had listened to all of this without expression. Then he had asked one question. The Marsh family, he said. What's the father's name? Hector told him. Reardon was quiet for a moment. He went inside. Hector waited, not certain what was going to happen. Having ridden 3 hours without any certainty that he'd find a man willing to do anything about what he'd told him, Reardon came back out. He had the rifle. He had the saddlebag. He had the expression that Hector would later describe to people as not angry. Exactly. Not anything that he had a word for, really. Just settled. The way a man looks when he's made a decision that came from somewhere deep enough that there was nothing above it to second guess. Go home, Reardon said. Are you coming? Hector said. Reardon was already saddling the horse. Go home, he said again. Take the south road. Don't go through town tonight. Hector went. Reardon rode west. He rode with the specific quality of a man who has put something away for a long time, and has taken it back out, and is finding that it fits exactly as it always did, which is not a comfortable feeling, but is an honest one. He had left violence behind because he understood what it cost. He had not, as it turned out, left it far enough behind to stay there when the cost of not using it exceeded the cost of using it. That line existed. He had always known it existed. He was riding toward it now. Cord Delham was not a stupid man. This was important to understand about him. The operation he ran, the discipline he maintained over men who were not naturally disciplined, The selection of targets and timing that had kept him ahead of every organized pursuit for 3 years. All of this required intelligence of a functional kind. He was not educated and was not interested in education, but he understood systems and leverage and the psychology of the people he victimized. And he used this understanding with the consistency that stupid men cannot maintain. But success produces a specific kind of blindness. 3 days of a town that had folded completely, no resistance, no organization, the law in a cage, and the people behind closed doors, had produced in Dellum and his men the blindness that comes from an unbroken record of things going according to expectation. When things go according to expectation long enough, you start to believe that expectation and reality are the same thing. You stop accounting for the things you haven't anticipated because nothing you haven't anticipated has happened yet. The farm burning had been one of his men, not him, Trask, who was the least disciplined of the 7 and whose usefulness was in direct tension with his tendency to escalate beyond what the situation required. The family had gotten out before the barn went fully, which was luck rather than mercy on Trask's part. Dellum had noted it without moving to address it. Because addressing it would require energy, he was spending on other things, and because the burning had its own value as a communication to the rest of the town. What Dellum had not known when he let the barn burn was the name of the family. He had not known because he hadn't asked. Because names of individual families in towns like this were not information he generally required. He knew their type, their situation, their capacity for resistance, and these were sufficient for his purposes. The family's name was Marsh. Thomas Marsh had worked alongside John Reardon for 2 years on a cattle drive in the man's earlier life, before Reardon had become a marshal, and before Marsh had come to Harrow's Bend to farm. They had not seen each other in years, but the kind of friendship made in hard work and hard country has a durability that time doesn't necessarily diminish. And Hector Vales had known to mention the name because he had heard Reardon ask about the man once, 2 years ago, in the kind of casual way that was not actually casual. Cordellan did not know any of this. He sat in the commandeered saloon on the evening of the 3rd day and drank the saloon's whiskey and was satisfied, in the self-contained way of a man who has assessed his situation and found it good. His men were comfortable. The town was compliant. The money they'd extracted was significant. There was no reason to leave immediately, and every reason to consolidate what they had before moving on. He was, by his own estimation, in complete control. 30 miles west. A man he'd never heard of was saddling a horse. Dellum poured another drink. On the 4th morning, while Reardon was still riding, still a day out, Trask made another mistake. He had been drinking since the previous evening and had the looseness of a man who has been drinking and has power and is finding the combination enjoyable. He rode through the residential streets, something Dellum had told them not to do, because it was unnecessary and created friction. And he stopped outside the alderman house and he called out names. The alderman boy, 14, made the mistake of appearing at the door. Trask said things to the boy that nobody outside the house heard, and the boy would not repeat. What the boy did, which was visible, was stand in the doorway, with his fists at his sides in the particular stance of a person who is too young to have fully learned the distinction between what his body wants to do and what his situation allows. He did not do anything, but Dellum heard about it, because Dellum made it his business to hear about things. And Dellum noted it with the cold attention of a man who understands that control of his men is as important as control of the town, and that Trask was becoming a liability. He was still deciding what to do about this when the 4th evening arrived, and with it, from the North Road, a single rider. He had stopped twice on the way. The first stop was at a homestead 4 miles east of Reardon's land, a widow named Clara Steele, whose well pump had been broken for 3 weeks. Which he knew because he had passed this way 2 months ago, and she had mentioned it with the careful understatement of a woman who has learned not to ask for things. He stopped and fixed the pump in the time it takes a competent man to fix a pump, and left without going to the door. He didn't know why he stopped. He had a specific destination and a specific urgency, and stopping was not, by any practical accounting, what the situation called for. But he stopped. He fixed the pump. He rode on. The second stop was at a family on the road. Father, mother, 3 children, whose wagon had a broken axle, and who were standing beside it with the desolate expression of people in a situation that has exceeded their resources. He assessed the axle, found the wood he needed from the wagon's own spare boards, made the repair with the tools from his saddlebag, helped them get moving. The father had asked where he was going. He had said west. The father had looked at him, at the rifle, at the expression, at the direction, and had said nothing further, but had gripped his hand when they parted in a way that meant something. He rode on. He arrived at the northern approach to Harrow's Bend in the late afternoon of the 4th day, and he stopped on the ridge above the town and looked at it for a long time. He had done this before, assessed a situation from high ground before entering it, out of habit and out of the practical value of knowing what you're walking into. He read the town the way you read country, for signs, for information, for the shape of what was actually there rather than what you expected to find. He read the emptiness of the streets, the specific placement of horses outside the saloon, the broken door on the jail, the barn at the edge of town that was half collapsed and smoke-stained in a way that was recent. He read the curtain moving at a window below him. Someone up here had seen him arrive, was watching him. He did not wave or signal. He simply stayed visible, on the ridge, for long enough that whoever was watching had time to read him in return. Then he rode down. He didn't go to the saloon. He went to the church, which was at the north end of the main street, and which was the kind of building that tends to be where people congregate when they're not safe to congregate publicly. He went to the back door and knocked in the specific way. 3 pause. 2 that Hector Vales had told him before they parted was the signal. The door opened. There were 11 people inside. Hector was among them, having arrived back hours ago. The sheriff was there out of the jail, which Hector explained had been left unlocked by one of Delham's men whose sloppiness had been interpreted as a gift. The Marsh family was there: Thomas, his wife, the 2 children. Thomas Marsh looked at him across the dim interior of the church, and something crossed his face that was not surprise, exactly, but the specific expression of a man who had hoped for something and had not let himself believe the hoping would amount to anything. John, he said. Thomas. Reardon said. They gripped hands. Reardon looked at the children. The daughter, 12, with her mother's eyes. The son, 9, who was looking at him with the frank assessment of a boy trying to determine who this person was and what they meant for the situation. He looked back at the group. Tell me everything, he said. What they have, where they sleep, how they move, who's reliable and who isn't, what time they're loudest and what time they're quietest. He listened for an hour. He asked questions that were specific and practical and that communicated, without his having to say so, that he was not there for ceremony. Then he said, I'm going to need 2 things from you. First, everyone stays inside tonight. No exceptions. Second, at dawn tomorrow, whoever is willing to stand at the end of the main street and be visible. I need 4 people who can do that without running. The sheriff raised his hand. Thomas Marsh raised his hand. 2 others. Reardon looked at them. Don't do anything, he said. Just stand there. That's all. Can you do that? They said they could. He nodded. He went back out into the evening. Delham found out there was a stranger in town. The way he found out most things through the man he paid, in whiskey and latitude, to tell him things. The man's name was Ferris, and he was not a bad man exactly, or not only a bad man, but a man who had made a series of small accommodations to the reality of the situation, and had arrived, through the accumulation of small accommodations, at a position he probably hadn't intended, and that he probably didn't examine closely. Ferris told Delham about the rider who had come from the north in the late afternoon and gone to the church. Delham listened. 1 man, he said. 1 man. Ferris confirmed. Delham looked at the ceiling of his commandeered saloon and thought about 1 man. Who is he? He said. Ferris said he didn't know. Nobody seemed to know. He'd come in quiet, gone to the church. The doors had closed. Delham thought about this. 1 man, moving quietly, going to where the town's resistance was organizing. He wasn't afraid of one man, he had 7, and even accounting for the variation in their reliability, 7 was a substantial arithmetic advantage. But one man who wasn't afraid to come to a town that a gang of 7 was controlling was a specific kind of man. And specific kinds of men warranted specific kinds of attention. He sent Trask and another man to the north end of town to watch the church through the night. This was the decision that revealed to Reardon the thing he needed to know. He had expected to be watched. He had positioned himself accordingly, had not stayed in the church, had left through the back while the conversation with the townspeople was still happening, had spent the night in the gap between 2 buildings on the east side of the main street where the shadow was complete, and the line of sight was comprehensive. He watched Trask and the other man take their position. He watched how they watched the direction of their attention, the gaps in it, the intervals at which one or the other moved or shifted or lost focus. He watched for 2 hours, and by the end of 2 hours he had a complete picture of both men and how they would behave in the morning. Then he walked the town, not visibly, not on the main street, through the back ways, the alleys, the gaps between buildings that a man learns when he takes the time to walk them in the dark. He walked the geography of Harrow's Bend the way he had always walked terrain before a situation, not to find where to attack, but to find where to stand. The difference was fundamental. A man looking for where to attack is playing his own game. A man finding where to stand is playing the other man's game and deciding in advance how it ends. He found his positions. 3 of them, each one connected to the others by routes that could be covered in seconds. He found the thing that Delham's men hadn't found, which was the roof access on the hardware store, a ladder on the interior, accessible through a back window, leading to a flat section of roof with a 2-foot lip that provided concealment and a clear view of the entire main street. He found the weakness in Delham's setup, which was the gap between the saloon's east wall and the building beside it, narrow enough that one man could cover it completely, wide enough that Delham's men would think it was a viable approach and would use it. He was done by 2 in the morning. He went back to his position between the buildings and slept for 3 hours, which was a thing he had trained himself to do. Sleep in segments, wake on schedule, arrive rested at whatever came next. At T5 in the morning, he was on the hardware store roof. He watched the dawn come over Harrow's Bend, the specific, unhurried way that dawn comes over a western town. The light building in the east, and the shadows in the street going from black to gray, to the first tentative warmth. And he thought about what the day was going to bring with the same calm he brought to everything, which was not the absence of awareness, but the management of it. The sheriff and Thomas Marsh and the 2 others were at the end of the main street at first light. The way he'd asked, 4 people standing in the open, visible, doing nothing. Delham saw them from the saloon window, and made his final mistake. He walked out with all 6 of his remaining men, leaving the saloon unguarded, leaving the east gap unguarded, stepping into the street in a line, in the confidence of a man who has 7 guns and believes that 7 guns is an argument that ends discussions. He had not found where Reardon was. He assumed this meant Reardon wasn't positioned. He was wrong. Reardon let them get to the middle of the street. He let them get there because the middle of the street was where he needed them, away from the doorways, away from the buildings, in the open, where they were visible, and where the residents of Harrow's Bend, watching from their windows, could see everything that happened without being in the path of it. He had told the sheriff and the 3 others one thing before the night was done. When I start, you take cover, not heroics. Cover. He had been specific about this because the worst outcomes in these situations came from people who weren't supposed to be involved getting involved. And he couldn't manage 7 men and 4 well-meaning civilians at the same time. He rose from behind the hardware store's roof. Lip. Delham, he said. His voice carried, in the morning quiet of the empty street, with the particular clarity of a voice that has learned to project without raising. Delham stopped. The 6 men beside him stopped. Delham looked at the roof and found Reardon and assessed what he was looking at. Who are you? Delham said. The man who's going to give you one chance to leave this town. Reardon said. That chance expires in about 30 seconds. Delum looked at him. He looked at the rifle, he looked at the roof, and the angle, and he was smart enough to do the arithmetic quickly. One man on a roof with a clear field of fire. Yes, but one man against 7. And a rifle takes time between shots that 7 men can use. What Delum couldn't see from where he was standing was that Reardon had not come alone. Not entirely. The sheriff, who had been told to take cover, had taken cover in the doorway of the hardware store with the rifle that one of Delum's men had not put away carefully enough the previous night. Thomas Marsh was at the far end of the main street, behind the water trough, with a shotgun that belonged to the church, and that nobody had thought to confiscate, because nobody had thought to look in a church for weapons. 3 people in 3 positions, not 7. But 3 people in the right positions is a different arithmetic than 7 people in the wrong one. What happened in the next, for minutes in the main street of Harrow's Bend was not the dramatic extended showdown of legend. It was not a long and cinematic exchange of fire, with heroic pauses for speeches. It was fast and loud and contained and professional, in the way that such things are when one side has prepared and the other side has not. 2 of Delum's men made the decision quickly. They put their guns down. The calculation, in the compressed time of a situation that is going wrong, was a simple one. The man on the roof was not going to miss. The man in the hardware store doorway was not going to miss. And the man behind the water trough had a shotgun. 3 of the remaining 5 were going to be left standing, best case. And 3 of the remaining 5 was not a winning position against a prepared opposition. 2 put their guns down. 3 others managed their calculation differently. They went for the east gap, which was where Reardon had known they would go, because he had left it visible and had positioned himself on the roof to cover it. He covered it. Trask, who had the looseness of a man who had been drinking since the previous night, and whose decision-making was accordingly compromised, went for the sheriff. The sheriff, who had 30 years of experience and a bad knee, and had made a decision about himself in the night that involved getting his badge back, was ready for this. Delum himself stood in the middle of the street and looked at the arithmetic that had just resolved against him and made the specific decision that separates certain men from others, the decision to recognize when a situation is over. He put his hands up, not because he was afraid, exactly, because he was intelligent enough to know when he'd lost. The street was quiet. It was a different quiet than the quiet of the preceding 4 days. Not the held breath quiet of fear, but the settled quiet of something that has resolved. The specific stillness that follows the end of a thing. Delum stood in the street with his hands up, and Reardon came down from the hardware store roof and walked toward him in the morning light. He had every reason. That was the honest accounting of the moment. Standing in front of the man who had terrorized a town for 4 days, who had put a friend in a burning barn and an old man in the dust, he had every reason. The 4 years of distance he had put between himself and violence had been maintained by the deliberate avoidance of exactly these moments. The moments where the reason presents itself and is legitimate, and the action it calls for is one he is more than capable of. He looked at Delum. Delum looked back at him with the specific expression of a man who is lost and knows it, and is waiting to find out what losing costs. Get the sheriff, Reardon said. To nobody in particular, to whoever was listening, the sheriff appeared from the hardware store doorway. He had his badge in his hand. It had been in his desk drawer, which Delum's men had not searched because it was a desk drawer in the jail that they controlled, and searching it had seemed unnecessary. He pinned it on with the deliberate care of a man doing something that matters. Cord Delum, the sheriff said. You're under arrest. Delum looked at the sheriff, looked at Reardon. You could have killed me, he said. To Reardon, the statement carrying the question implicit in it. Yes, Reardon said. Why didn't you? Delum said. Reardon looked at him for a moment. Because killing you would have been about me, he said. Arresting you is about the town. Delum seemed to think about this. He put his hands behind his back for the cuffs. The young one, Harlan, 19 years old, the youngest of Delum 7, and the one who had put his gun down first, and put it down with the particular speed of someone who had been waiting for permission. Stood at the edge of the gathering looking at the ground. Reardon went to him. Harlan looked up. "How long have you been riding with him?" Reardon said. 8 months, Harlan said. "Before that?" Reardon said. "I worked cattle," Harlan said. "Down south." Reardon looked at him. At the 19-year-old face, with the particular combination of hardness and uncertainty that 19 wears when it has spent 8 months in the wrong company and isn't sure what to do with the knowledge that it's been wrong. "I know outfit in Colorado that's short-handed," Reardon said. "They don't ask questions about the last 8 months. They ask questions about whether you can work." Harlan looked at him. "Why would you do that?" he said. "Because 8 months isn't 8 years, Reardon said. "And because you put the gun down." He handed him a piece of paper. He had written the outfit's name and location the previous night, in the church, in the hour before he'd gone out to walk the town. He had not known then that he would have cause to use it. He had written it anyway, because this was always a possibility in these situations, and because certain possibilities were worth preparing for. Harlan took the paper, looked at it, looked at Reardon. He didn't say thank you. He was 19. And didn't quite know how to say thank you to someone who had just given him something larger than the vocabulary of it. But something in his face said it. Reardon nodded. He walked away. Peace returned to Harrow's Bend in the way that peace returns after something like this. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in increments. Doors opening, children appearing in the street, the particular sound of a town, resuming the ordinary business of being a town, which is the best sound a place can make after a period of silence. The general store owner came out and looked at the ledger that Dellum's men had kept, and tore it in half, which was not legally meaningful, but was personally necessary, and which the small crowd that witnessed it understood and did not comment on. The farmer whose harvest had been taken found 3 of Dellum's men, under the sheriff's supervision, loading it back onto his wagon. Not all of it, some had been consumed, but most. The farmer stood and watched this without expression, because the expression required would have been too much for a public space. Clara Steele, the widow with the pump, arrived in Harrow's Bend that afternoon. She came sometimes on Wednesdays for supplies and found a town that was different than the town she'd left on Monday, and heard the story in pieces from May Patterson at the general store, and listened to the part about the lone rider who had come from the north with something different in her face than the other listeners had. Thomas Marsh found Reardon at the livery, tending his horse in the preparation of departure. "You're leaving?" Thomas said. "Tonight," Reardon said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Stay," he said. "A few days at least. People want to, I know," Reardon said. "Then stay," Thomas said. Reardon looked at him. "I'm not good at that part," he said. "The after." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. The look of a man who knows another man well enough to know when arguing is not going to produce a different outcome. "Where will you go?" he said. "East," Reardon said. "There's usually work east." Thomas nodded slowly. "The Marsh family owes you something that doesn't have a name," he said. "You don't owe me anything," Reardon said. "I know that's what you think," Thomas said. "I'm telling you what I think." They gripped hands. Reardon finished with the horse. He rode out at dusk, from the south end of Harrow's Bend, which took him past the sheriff's office, where the lights were on and the sound of ordinary law enforcement business was audible through the open window, past the general store, where the owner was fixing the broken door with the focused satisfaction of a man reclaiming his own property, past the residential street where the alderman boy was sitting on his porch in the evening, doing nothing in particular except being outside, which was its own kind of statement. The boy watched him pass. Reardon touched the brim of his hat. The boy raised his hand. He rode on. He rode out into the frontier evening with the particular feeling of a man who has done the thing and is leaving the after to the people who are better at it, which is the right division of labor, and which he had learned, over years, to accept as sufficient. He thought about the pump. He thought about the wagon axle. He thought about Harlan's piece of paper. He thought about these things, not because they were the largest things of the day, but because they were, in his private accounting, the truest measure of what the day had been. The confrontation in the street was what people would remember. It had the shape of a story, the elements of narrative, the beginning and middle and end that make something retellable. But the pump and the axle and the 19-year-old with a piece of paper, those were the things that had actually mattered. The quiet things done on the way to the loud thing and after it. This was what he knew about the work, after all the years of it, that the legend was never the point, that the point was always the person behind the closed door, the child at the window, the family who needed the harvest back, the young man who needed a direction that wasn't the one he'd been traveling. The point was never the confrontation. The point was what the confrontation made possible. He rode into the dark of the frontier and let Harrow's Bend close behind him, and thought about nothing in particular, which was the best state for a long ride. And the horse moved easy beneath him, and the stars were out after 3 days of cloud, and the country was wide and quiet in the way it gets when the wind drops and everything settles. He did not know where he was going. He was going east. There was usually work east. The bandits thought they had already won. They had counted their guns, and counted the town's fear, and done the arithmetic, and found it satisfactory. What they had not counted was the thing that cannot be quantified. The man who hears about a friend's burning barn and makes a decision not because he wants to, but because the alternative is worse. True strength is not the fastest gun. True strength is not the loudest threat. True strength is the man who has every reason to stay out of it, and rides toward it anyway, who fixes a pump on the way, who gives a 19-year-old a piece of paper instead of a consequence, who leaves before the thanks. The strongest cowboys are not the ones history makes legends of. They are the ones who ride back into the dark when it's done, toward the next thing that needs doing, asking nothing, carrying everything. The Old West remembered them, not in monuments, in the people they left standing. If you enjoyed this cowboy story about courage, frontier justice, and redemption, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Broken Spur Stories, and turn on notifications for more emotional Western stories inspired by the Old West. Share this story with someone who loves classic cowboy adventures, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were the only person brave enough to face the bandits?